Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances centered around the Kupiansk section of the front line in the north and the Kurakhove section in the south, where the Russians are advancing on a daily basis. There is some back and forth in the Service River line east of Liman, west of Kremenna. Starting out in the south, we see that the Russians have managed to capture Maximivka. With this, the Russians have full control over every settlement north of the river line near Volodar. With this, the Russians are now able to choose the next direction of their offensive operations, whether it will be directed towards Kurakhove, in the northern direction towards Rusliv to cut the supplies of Kurakhove, or attack in the direction of Velika Novoselka, or a mixture of 2, 3, all of them, whichever it is. The Russians are now have the initiative to choose which direction to go. In the eastern direction, we see the Russians have moved further within Ivanivka as the Russian offensive operations within settlements continue. Further north, the Russians have managed to advance and capture more of Vovchenka as well as the mine area west of Kurakhove. With this, heavy fighting continues in this direction as well. In the northern direction, the Russians have advanced south of Novodimitrivka, advancing along the forest lines to flank the Ukrainian positions near Vosnesenka and Sonsivka, as well as Soria, moving in between these three settlements. Moving on to the Service River line, the Russians are advancing towards Yampolivka in the north and have been kicked out of Tursk in the south. Again, this is one of the most difficult battles as they have to move through a lot of open fields before they manage to get close enough to Tursk, where the Ukrainians have significant forces stationed. It's a very difficult battle to undertake, and this is why the Russians are struggling to gain a foothold and hold a foothold within Tursk, as I predicted before the battle began. Moving on to the Borova direction, the Russians have managed to capture Pershetravneve. They've advanced along the forest lines and the main road between Svatove and Pershetravneve, and with this the Russians are developing the offensive operations towards Borova. The Russians have also managed to advance north of it, aligning the front line along the forest lines near Vishneve, and they've managed to close the gap south of Pishane, securing the main road that we see here that moves through from the east from Berestova towards Krukhliakivka. With this, a paved road is now under Russian control, and this allows the Russians to properly supply the front lines here in the Kupiansk direction. So we see heavy fighting is taking place in the northern direction as well. There's been no updates in the Kursk direction. Returning to the south, the Russians are here advancing towards Kurakhove with 4 main axes of attack: the southwestern, southeastern, northeastern, and northwestern directions. There's also potentially an eastern direction where we are seeing fighting taking place in the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove. It's unclear on what has happened since. There's not a lot of updates from that direction. It's very difficult to get footage from either side considering how tense the fighting is. And from the southern direction, there's a potential second or third direction where the Russians can advance directly towards Usperivka, but in general there's a lot of fighting in the direction of Kurakhove from a lot of different directions. The objective of the Russians is clear. It is to force the Ukrainians to withdraw from these pockets that are being formed towards Kurakhove or outside to the rear. The objective is to hit the Ukrainians while they are on the move with artillery, FPV drones, and long-range strikes, which will allow them to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians without fighting them directly. So the Russians are moving slowly along the settlements the Ukrainians have available here in the south of Kurakhove, where they are attacking one by one, pushing the Ukrainians out and forcing them to withdraw. We have 3 different styles of fighting depending on where the fighting is taking place. In the direction of Maximivka, the main sort of fighting is that the Russians first storm the settlement with motorcycles and ATVs, which largely ignore the muddy season as well as mines. Most mines don't explode on the low weights that comes from motorcycles, which allows Russians to gain a foothold, as we saw previous day. Following that, mine-clearing vehicles and other vehicles appear to give the support for the first foothold that they've gained with their motorcycles and ATVs. It also comes a drop of additional infantry that are then moving to clear the settlements. The Russians now have to clear settlement after settlement, as there's a lot of buildings, but if they have enough forces, it goes fairly quickly, especially considering that the Ukrainians did not have a large concentration of forces in this area. They had few units covering a large section of the front line based on the hold of Vuhledar. Following that, no additional reinforcements at a significant rate arrived to cover the much larger area that now needed to be defended, and this allowed the Russians to take advantage of that to launch a new operation, which then looked to capture these 5 settlements in just 2 weeks. In the eastern direction of Ivanivka and Antonivka, there's not a lot of use for these motorcycles and ATVs, because the Ukrainians have a much stronger force here. They have the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, which equips Leopards and other Western vehicles. They are actively using these vehicles to defend Antonivka and the settlements in the area. This is why the Russian advances here are much smaller and slower. The Russians are facing off against these Ukrainian vehicles, and at the same time, the Ukrainians also have a lot more FPV and artillery in this direction, which they can use on these armored vehicles. The Ukrainians could also use FPV drones and artillery on the motorcycles and ATVs, but they simply are not important enough targets to use these equipment, because otherwise there would be too much for the Ukrainians to hit and they wouldn't have enough ammunition to do so. So tanks and armored fighting vehicles are high priority targets. ATVs and infantry on a single basis, like one personnel, is not really a priority at all. They may even be excluded from the hit list and not allowed to be shot at. So the Russians have a much easier time getting a foothold, which then allows them to follow up with additional assaults. Why does the Russians getting a foothold stop the Ukrainians from hitting armored vehicles with FPV drones? It's because when the Russians move closer, the Ukrainians have to reorganize their forces to adapt to the situation. They may send an assault squad to kick the Russians out following their foothold gained, and they may withdraw FPV drone operators further back, stuff like that, and this then changes the situation. If they're on the move, they can't really cover the skies with their drones. So in general, the situation changes once the Russians move closer, and this is the window of opportunity the Russians take advantage of. Not to say they never get shot at by drones and artillery. Even ATV operators and motorcycle riders, they also get shot at by FPV drones and artillery, but they are more maneuverable. It's easier for them to dodge them, which typically means that they have a higher success rate, while tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, they aren't really that maneuverable. The third type of battle taking place is the forest line battle, where the Russians move from forest line to forest line. Here it's mostly just infantry that move through the forest lines, and sometimes there's a drop-off from armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles clearing a forest line from Ukrainian soldiers and dropping off their own. But for the most part, it's just positional fighting with infantry taking the lead, covering the areas with FPV drones, and then moving in once it's clear, after which they capture, forest line after forest line until they reach their destination. In general, we can expect that in this month of November, the Russians will continue their offensive operations towards Kurakhove. They may even capture Kurakhove and this general pocket by the end of the month. This would lead to the Russians capturing a large section of the front line and improving their positions to launch further operations towards Velika Novoselka, Pokrovsk in the north, and so on. While Pokrovsk itself, fighting is unlikely to begin prior to the capture of Kurakhove, and likely also prior to the capture of the highway between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, where the Russians will use that as an additional axis to attack Pokrovsk. Further north, there's also this geolocated footage of fighting here near Ivanivka, where the Russians have captured the southern part of the road. It's not really clear the situation here because there's some back and forth. Sometimes the Russians were geolocated within Ivanivka, then suddenly they're not there anymore, mostly due to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Ivanivka. And there's really been no offensive operations by the Russians towards that fortified position either. So it's not clear what the situation is, why there's even positional fighting here, and so on. But it is what it is. This geolocated footage shows Russian presence here south of Ivanivka, so the map has to change. In the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians have a stronger presence near Liman. The closer you get to Liman, the more powerful their defensive operations become. In the northern direction, it has significantly weakened following the Russian capture of the Serbets River line. This has allowed for several Russian offensive operations taking place in the northern direction. And this is something that I am talking about when I talk about a collapse of the Ukrainian lines. We can very clearly see areas of the front line where the Ukrainians have properly covered it and how difficult it is for the Russians to advance. And then we see areas in the front line where there are such significant cracks that the Russians simply advance on a daily basis, capturing over 100 square kilometers in a small section of the front line within a month. In the southern direction between Pokrovsk or Sledova in the north and Volodar in the south, the Russians have managed to capture over 350 square kilometers in a single month, which was approximately the amount of territory the Russians captured between February and May this year, where in May they captured a lot because of the Kharkiv offensive, which captured about 250 square kilometers. So yes, they captured more than the Kharkiv offensive in a single month of October in a well-fortified area of the front line with industrial areas, with mines, and all of these difficult parts. They even captured Sledova, which is a 20,000 population city. They have gained a foothold within Kurakhove, which is another 20,000 population city. So we see so much was taken in such a short time compared to what they usually take due to the lack of the Ukrainian defensive capabilities, and that is in comparison to what we see in the Siversk direction, in the Turetsk direction, in the Chasiv Yar direction. It is a complete collapse of their defensive capabilities. Even in the Chasiv Yar direction, which is a prioritized area, the Ukrainians are struggling. The Russians captured the eastern parts of the city, they flanked it from the south, and they have a foothold in the north. They're even dropping leaflets to ask the Ukrainians to surrender, just like they did ahead of the storming of Avdiivka. And if this is a similar case, then the Russians may capture Chasiv Yar this month as well, which would lead to, well, a similar situation to the entire pocket which was created and captured by the Russian forces following the capture of Avdiivka. Something similar could happen in the Chasiv Yar direction following the capture of Chasiv Yar. And that is exactly how significant this settlement is for the Ukrainians, yet the Russians have managed to gain such significant advances due to the lack of defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians. So it is a gradual decline of the Ukrainian defensive capabilities as battle of attrition continues, but collapse gets more views, so that's how I describe it. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.